110 degrees. That was the heat of the desert sand against my face when the man I called my husband for 12 years threw my purse into the dirt, kicked me out of the car, and sped away. He didn't just steal my pension, he tried to steal my life. But he forgot one thing. A doctor knows exactly where to cut to remove a cancer. Let me tell you how it all began. Right there on that shimmering stretch of asphalt cutting through the Mojave, where the sky looked like it was bleeding and the air felt like a physical weight pressing against my lungs. The silence inside our black Lexus SUV had been deafening for the last 50 miles. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands trembling as I held the printouts I'd found tucked away in the back of Kyle's office. They weren't just bank statements, they were a roadmap of betrayal. Every cent I had meticulously saved from 12 years of graveyard shifts, double rotations at the hospital, and the malpractice insurance fund that was my only safety net, all gone. Disappeared into a real estate development that didn't exist, a ghost project meant to mask his spiraling gambling debts and failed hustles. When I finally found my voice to ask him why, the man I thought I knew vanished. In his place sat a stranger with cold, calculating eyes and a sneer that made my skin crawl. He didn't offer an apology or an explanation. He didn't even look guilty. Instead, he just laughed, a dry, rasping sound that was more terrifying than any scream. "You've always been so rigid, Lauren," Kyle said, his voice dripping with a newfound venom as he gripped the steering wheel. "So obsessed with your ethics and your hard work. Did you really think a woman like you was meant for anything more than being a bank account for someone who actually knows how to live?" I looked at him, truly looked at him, and realized that for over a decade, I hadn't been a wife. I had been a low-interest loan. I looked into the rearview mirror at Janice, the girl I had raised since she was 9 years old. I had stayed up late helping her with her SATs, paid for her private tutors, and just last month, I'd written a check for her final semester of college that I now realized was probably the last of my liquid assets. I expected to see shock on her face, or at least a flicker of sympathy. Instead, Janice was scrolling through her phone, her expression bored, her lips curled in a mirror image of her father's arrogance. Suddenly, the car jerked toward the shoulder. The tires shrieked against the gravel as Kyle slammed on the brakes. Before I could process the movement, he leaned across the console, his face inches from mine. "I'm done listening to your moralizing, Lauren. I'm done with the doctor lectures. You want to talk about self-reliance? About how people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps?" He reached over, unbuckled my seatbelt, and shoved me hard toward the door. The heat hit me like a furnace blast as the door swung open. He grabbed my designer purse, the only thing he'd ever bought me that wasn't for his own benefit, and flung it out into the sagebrush. "Get out!" he barked. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Kyle, we're 40 miles from the nearest town. It's over 100 degrees out there. You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," he replied, his voice chillingly calm. "Since you're so smart, so capable, so self-made, I figured you wouldn't mind the walk. Consider it a clinical trial for your survival skills." I looked at Janice, my voice a desperate whisper. "Janice, please. You know he's not thinking straight. Help me." Janice didn't even look up from her screen at first. Then she slowly lowered her phone, her eyes meeting mine with a cold, piercing indifference that hurt more than the desert sun ever could. "You always taught me about the value of grit and independence, right, Dr. Price?" she said, using the formal title like a weapon. "You're always saying how the American dream is built on individual effort. Let's see how you handle a little real-world application. Maybe you can diagnose your way out of a heat stroke." The sheer cruelty of it left me breathless. I was pushed out of the car, stumbling onto the hot, jagged rocks of the roadside. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the empty canyon. Through the tinted glass, I saw Kyle put the car in gear. He didn't look back. Janice didn't look back. The engine roared and the SUV surged forward, kicking up a cloud of choking dust and grit that settled in my hair and on my clothes. I stood there, clutching the strap of my bag, watching the red taillights disappear into the shimmering heat haze of the horizon. 12 years of sacrifice, of being the rock of the family, of saving every penny and skipping every vacation so they could have the best. It all vanished in a trail of exhaust. I was a doctor who had spent my life healing others, and yet I hadn't seen the rot growing in my own home until it had consumed everything. My hands were shaking, but as the silence of the desert swallowed the sound of the receding engine, a different feeling began to take root in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just fear. It was a cold, clinical clarity. Kyle thought he had left me to die. He thought he had taken my power when he took my money. He was wrong. He had only stripped away the distractions. It hurts to realize that the people you loved most are the ones who want to see you fail. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for? Like this video and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I need to know I'm not alone on this road. The sun was no longer a celestial body. It had become a pulsing yellow eye that refused to blink. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes felt like hours, and the shimmering heat waves rising from the blacktop made the road ahead look like a river that kept receding the closer I got. My throat was a desert of its own, parched and raw. I clutched my bag to my chest, the leather sticky against my skin. Just as my knees began to buckle, a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the soles of my shoes. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of Kyle's luxury SUV. It was the deep, guttural growl of a diesel engine, a heavy, industrial heartbeat. A convoy of 3 tractor-trailers appeared on the horizon, hauling heavy machinery toward the Nevada border. I didn't have the strength to wave. I simply stood there, a ghost in a wilted linen suit. The lead truck, a battered but proud Peterbilt, slowed to a crawl, its air brakes hissing like a warning to the desert itself. The driver, a man with skin like tanned leather and eyes that had seen a million miles of American road, didn't ask questions. He saw a woman in expensive clothes standing in the middle of nowhere, with a look of shattered dignity, and he knew enough. As he helped me up into the cab, the blast of the air conditioner felt like a benediction, and the world finally went black. I drifted into a fever dream fueled by exhaustion and the rhythmic roar of the truck's engine. In that hazy space, I wasn't on a highway. I was back in 2012, in our cramped first apartment in San Jose. I remembered the smell of cheap coffee and the sound of the radiator clanking in the middle of the night. Those were the years of the great hustle, as Kyle used to call them, though looking back, I was the only one doing the bustling. I was a junior resident then, working 48-hour rotations that left my eyes bloodshot and my bones aching with a weariness no amount of sleep could fix. I remembered coming home at 3 a.m., my feet swollen in my sensible medical clogs, only to find Kyle sprawled on the couch surrounded by investment brochures and empty beer bottles. He had big dreams, always talking about the American dream, as if it were a lottery ticket he just needed to find, while I treated it like a garden that needed to be watered with sweat every single day. I was the daughter of a woman who lived through the tail end of the Depression. I knew the value of a nickel, and I knew that luck was just another word for preparation. I remembered the day I decided to take on extra shifts at the urgent care clinic, just so we could afford the tuition for Janice's private middle school. She wasn't my biological daughter, but from the moment I married Kyle, I treated her like she was the center of my universe. I remembered the look on her face when I brought home that expensive, hand-stitched dress for her spring formal, a dress I'd paid for by skipping lunch for 3 months. I had been so proud of her, so eager to give her the stability I had struggled for. I wanted her to see a woman who was a healer, a provider, a pillar of strength. Instead, I see now that I was raising a predator. I was teaching her that my labor was her birthright, that my sacrifices were merely her due. While I was saving every scrap, repairing my own shoes, and driving a 10-year-old sedan so they could have the best of everything, Kyle was learning how to play the part of a successful man using my credentials as his collateral. He would boast at dinner parties about our portfolio, never mentioning that the seed money came from my inheritance from my grandmother, or that the monthly mortgage was paid by my surgical bonuses. The red flags were there, hidden in plain sight, like hairline fractures in a weight-bearing wall. There were the business trips to Tahoe that never seemed to result in a closed deal. There was the sudden, jarring change in his office password, a space I had always been welcome in until I started asking questions about why our joint savings account was stagnating, despite my six-figure salary. He would deflect with a charming smile or a condescending pat on the hand, telling me I should stick to the medicine and let him handle the complicated math. He knew how to weaponize my own professional exhaustion against me. I was too tired to argue, too busy saving lives at the hospital to realize my own home was being gutted from the inside out. I had built a fortress of security for them, brick by brick, only to find out that they had been selling the bricks behind my back to fund a life of illusions. As the truck rumbled on toward safety, the warmth of these memories turned cold, curdling into a bitter realization. My kindness hadn't been a bridge for them, it had been a doormat. And Kyle hadn't just been stealing my money. He had been preparing his exit strategy for years, waiting for the moment when I was no longer useful to discard me like yesterday's news. The truck driver, a man named Silas who spoke in low, gravelly tones, dropped me off at a sun-bleached gas station on the outskirts of a town called Silver Ridge. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a California tourism brochure. It was a town of dust, rusted corrugated metal, and people with deep lines etched into their faces from years of honest, back-breaking labor. As I stood on the cracked pavement, watching Silas's rig disappear into the horizon, I looked down at my hands. They were filthy, my fingernails broken, my expensive wedding band, the one Kyle had insisted on financing with my own savings, glinting mockingly in the harsh light. I took it off. I didn't throw it. I tucked it into the deepest pocket of my purse. That gold was mine. I had earned it, and I wasn't going to waste even a gram of its value on a dramatic gesture. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the police in San Jose. I knew Kyle's type. He would have a story ready, a narrative where I was the unstable wife who had a breakdown in the desert. If I went back now, I'd be walking into a trap he'd been setting for months. Instead, I walked toward the center of town. I found a small, single-story brick building with a faded sign that read, "The Ridge Community Health Post, closed until further notice." The windows were thick with grime, and a "For Rent" sign hung limply in the door. It was a skeleton of a clinic, abandoned by a county that had run out of funds, and a series of doctors who preferred the high-rise offices of Palo Alto to the grit of a mining town. I used the last of the emergency cash I kept tucked in a hidden flap of my wallet to rent a room at a motel that smelled of pine sol and old tobacco. That night, I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the saggy mattress and mapped out my inventory. I had my medical license, my board certifications, which I luckily kept digital copies of, and a fierce, burning need to prove that Janice's mockery was the greatest mistake of her life. She wanted to see how I'd self-rely my way out of this? Fine. I would show her exactly what a woman with a medical degree and a spine of tempered steel could do. The next morning, I didn't head for the bus station. I headed for the town's small administrative office. I met a man named Arthur, the acting mayor and a retired foreman who looked at my wrinkled linen suit with open skepticism. "We don't need a tourist, lady," he said, not unkindly. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice steady and devoid of the doctor's wife softness I'd adopted for Kyle's benefit. "I'm not a tourist, Arthur. I'm an internist with 12 years of experience in high-volume trauma and chronic care. Your clinic is closed, your people are driving 2 hours for a basic insulin script, and your town is hurting. I'll reopen that post. I'll handle the overhead. I just need the keys and a 6-month waiver on the property tax until I can get the billing cycles running." He laughed, a dry sound. And why would a fancy doctor from the coast want to rot in Silver Ridge? Because in the city, people pay you to hide their problems, I replied, leaning over his desk. Here, I suspect people just want to get back to work. And so do I. The work was grueling. For the first 2 weeks, I wasn't a doctor. I was a janitor. I scrubbed floors until my back screamed. I repainted the peeling walls with surplus beige paint I bought from the local hardware store. I spent hours on the phone with medical supply companies, using my remaining credit to negotiate for refurbished EKG machines and basic lab kits. I was frugal to the point of obsession, just as I had been in the early days of residency. I ate canned soup and slept in the back room of the clinic on a cot. The locals watched me from a distance, waiting for the rich lady to break. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. A frantic pounding on the clinic door woke me at 2 a.m. It was a young man, barely older than Janice, cradling his hand which had been crushed in a hydraulic lift at a nearby garage. He was gray with pain, slipping into shock. I didn't have a nurse. I didn't have an anesthesiologist. I had a bottle of antiseptic, a local numbing agent, and the muscle memory of 1,000 surgeries. Look at me, I commanded, my voice the only stable thing in the room. I've got you, but you have to stay with me. For 3 hours, I worked under the buzzing fluorescent lights, meticulously debriding the wound and resetting the bones. I used every ounce of my skill to save his fingers, to save his livelihood. When I finally finished, the sun was beginning to peek over the ridge. The boy's father, a rugged man who hadn't said a word the whole time, handed me a thermos of lukewarm coffee. I heard what they say about you, the father whispered, that you're just passing through. But a person who cleans their own floors and stays up all night for a stranger, that's a person who belongs. In that moment, standing in a cramped, dusty clinic in a town Kyle couldn't find on a map, I felt a surge of power that my 6-figure salary had never given me. Janice thought she had left me with nothing. She didn't realize that by stripping away the house, the car, and the status, she had accidentally returned me to the one thing Kyle could never steal: my vocation. I wasn't Lauren Price, the bank account. I was Dr. Price. And I was just getting started. 6 months in Silver Ridge had changed me. My hands, once pampered with expensive lotions and manicures, were now calloused and smelled faintly of antiseptic and mountain dust. My wardrobe consisted of sturdy scrubs and a single, well-pressed white coat that had become a symbol of hope in this forgotten corner of the world. I was no longer the wife of a high flyer. I was the woman who saved Arthur's grandson from a severe asthma attack, and the one who sat for 4 hours with Mrs. Gable, just to explain her heart medication. I was making a fraction of my old salary, but for the first time in a decade, my soul felt solvent. I had found a rhythm in the simplicity of hard work, and the nightmares of the Mojave Desert were starting to fade into a dull ache. That was until a courier arrived at the clinic on a Tuesday morning, carrying a thick, cream-colored envelope that felt like a block of ice in my hands. It bore the seal of the California Medical Board and the letterhead of a prestigious law firm in San Francisco. I retreated to my small office, the one I had painted myself, and tore the envelope open. As a doctor, I'm trained to read between the lines of a patient's chart, to find the hidden pathology that the symptoms are trying to mask. I applied that same clinical focus to the legal jargon in front of me. The words medical malpractice, fraudulent representation, and wrongful death jumped off the page like a series of malignant tumors. My heart didn't race, it went cold. The documents allege that I, Dr. Lauren Price, had served as the lead clinical investigator for a new pharmaceutical trial by a company called Apex Bio. According to the records, I had signed off on a series of patient reports that deliberately minimized the side effects of a new cardiovascular drug, a drug that had recently caused 3 fatal strokes in a suburban clinic near San Jose. I stared at the signatures on the bottom of the affidavits. They were perfect. The L had the same sharp upward stroke I'd used since medical school. The P had the slight tilt that my colleagues used to tease me about. But the dates. Those dates were the smoking gun. Every single signature was dated during the final 18 months of my marriage. I looked closer, my mind flashing back to the nights Kyle would come into my study with a stack of routine insurance paperwork while I was exhausted after a 30-hour shift. "Just sign here, honey," he'd say with that charming, boyish grin. "It's just the renewal for the joint liability policy. I'm trying to save you some time." I had trusted him. I had been so busy being the provider, the nurturer, and the healer that I hadn't realized I was signing my own professional death warrant. Kyle hadn't just stolen my pension. He had turned my life's work into a shield for his fraudulent investments. He didn't just want my money. He wanted my identity to cover his tracks. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. While I was working myself to the bone to pay for Janice's luxury apartment in the city and her influencer lifestyle, they were busy using my NPI number to rake in kickbacks from a pharmaceutical company that was selling poison. The American dream I had believed in, the one where integrity and labor guaranteed security, had been weaponized against me by the very people I was trying to protect. If these charges stuck, I wouldn't just be broke. I'd be a pariah. I would lose my license, my reputation, and likely my freedom. Kyle wasn't just letting me self-rely on a desert road. He was counting on me being too broken, too isolated, or too dead to defend myself when the house of cards finally collapsed. He thought he had buried me in Silver Ridge, far away from the world of high-stakes litigation and board hearings. I sat there for a long time, the shadows in my office lengthening as the sun dipped behind the mountains. A younger version of me might have panicked. A weaker version might have called Kyle, begging for an explanation. But that version of Lauren Price had died in the 110-degree heat of the Mojave. I pulled out a legal pad and began to make a list, my movements precise and methodical. I didn't need a lawyer yet. I needed a timeline. I needed to cross-reference my hospital logs, my surgical schedules, and my credit card statements from 2 years ago. I remembered Janice's sneer. "Let's see how you handle a little real-world application." Well, Janice, here was the application. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was a dissection. Kyle thought he was playing a game of real estate, but he had stepped into my operating room. And in my world, we don't just treat the symptoms. We cut out the rot at its source. The clinic in Silver Ridge became my sanctuary by day and my war room by night. To the townspeople, I was still the steady, soft-spoken Dr. Price, who worked until her eyes were bloodshot. But when the closed sign flipped over at 7 p.m., a different woman emerged. I swapped my stethoscope for a highlighter and my bedside manner for the cold, calculating precision of a forensic auditor. I knew how Kyle's mind worked. He assumed I was a big-picture person, someone who looked at the horizon while he dug a pit at my feet. He forgot that a doctor lives and dies by the small picture. We notice the decimal point that's out of place. We notice the slight discoloration in a lung scan that everyone else misses. I began my shadow work by pulling every hospital log and surgical schedule from my time at St. Jude's in San Jose. I didn't reach out to lawyers yet. I reached out to the people who actually ran the world, the head nurses and the medical records administrators. I called Sarah, a woman who had been the gatekeeper of the surgical wing for 20 years. I kept my voice light, the tone of a woman merely organizing her archives for a potential fellowship application. "Sarah, honey, I'm trying to reconcile my 2024 caseload for a research paper," I told her, my voice as smooth as glass. "Could you pull the time-stamped logs for the nights I was on call in November and December?" Sarah didn't hesitate. She remembered me as the doctor who brought the staff coffee during 12-hour shifts and never looked down on a CNA. Within 48 hours, my encrypted inbox was flooded with the receipts. I sat at my small wooden desk, the desert wind rattling the window panes, and began the grueling process of cross-referencing. It was a masterpiece of fraud. According to the Apex Bio documents, I had supposedly been in a boardroom in Palo Alto signing clinical affidavits on November 14th at 2 p.m. But Sarah's logs showed I was in the middle of a 6-hour quadruple bypass surgery at that exact moment. There were digital footprints, scrub-in records, and an anesthesiologist report with my name on it. Kyle hadn't just forged my name. He had forged a reality that was physically impossible. I felt a chilling sense of intellectual satisfaction as the pile of discrepancies grew. Every red flag I had ignored over the past 3 years now stood out like a neon sign. I remembered the nights he'd brought me those insurance forms while I was practically nodding off into my dinner. He'd leaned over my shoulder, his hand heavy on my back, not in a gesture of affection, but to guide my pen. I realized now that Janice had often been there too, distracting me with mindless chatter about her latest shopping trip or a fake crisis at her university. They were a team. They had treated my exhaustion as a resource to be mined. They thought they were the clever ones, the hustlers, who had outmaneuvered the rigid doctor. But their arrogance was their Achilles heel. They had left a trail of breadcrumbs so obvious that it was almost insulting to my intelligence. They had relied on me being too broken to look back. But I wasn't broken. I was undergoing a transformation. In the quiet of that clinic, I was building a digital fortress. I spent hours scanning every document into a secure, off-site cloud server that even a high-priced San Francisco hacker couldn't touch. I learned how to track the IP addresses of the emails Kyle had sent using my secondary, professional account, the one he thought I never checked. I found the correspondence with Apex Bio, where he had masqueraded as my business manager, negotiating consulting fees that were nothing more than laundered bribes. I watched as the numbers added up. $2 million diverted into a series of shell companies registered in Delaware. It was a surgical dissection of a betrayal. Every time my heart started to ache for the man I thought I loved, or the girl I had raised, I looked back at the wrongful death page in the medical board's file. 3 people were dead because Kyle Clark wanted a faster car, and Janice wanted a designer lifestyle. That was the moment my grief turned into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just doing this for my license anymore. I was doing it for those 3 families who didn't even know they had been cheated out of justice by a man who looked like a gentleman. I maintained my matriarch mask with terrifying efficiency. On the rare occasions I had to call our old house to check on a misplaced file, a tactical move to keep Kyle believing I was still in a state of confused submission, I kept my voice small and hesitant. I let him mansplain the situation to me, telling me that things were being handled and that I should just stay out of sight in that little town of yours. I could almost hear the smug grin on his face through the phone. I could hear Janice laughing in the background, probably picking out a new outfit for the hearing they thought I would never attend. Let them laugh. Let them think they were the ones holding the scalpel. They had no idea that I was already in the room, watching every move they made, waiting for the exact moment to make the first incision. The doctor was back in session, and the diagnosis for Kyle Clark was terminal. Success in Silver Ridge didn't look like the marble floors or the glass-walled offices of my old practice in San Jose. It looked like the basket of fresh peaches Mr. Henderson left on the clinic's doorstep every Monday morning. It looked like the quiet nods of respect I received at the local hardware store, and the way the town's children no longer feared the woman in the white coat. By the end of my first year, the health post had officially become Price Medical, the beating heart of the community. I had hired a local retired nurse, Martha, whose laugh was as loud as her clinical instincts were sharp. Together, we had built something out of nothing. I was making a fraction of my former salary, but every dollar was clean. Every cent was a testament to the self-reliance that Janice had mocked. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving on my own terms, reclaiming the American dream that my grandmother had whispered about, the one built on the dignity of a job well done. While I was building a legacy of healing in the mountains, I watched from my digital war room as Kyle's empire of shadows began to evaporate. I had set up a series of Google alerts for Clark developments and Kyle Clark, and the notifications were starting to chime with a delicious, rhythmic frequency. The headlines were no longer about emerging tech corridors or visionary real estate. Now, they spoke of liquidity crises, construction delays, and investor lawsuits. I saw photos of him in the local San Jose business journals, and the change was startling. The boyish charm was gone, replaced by a frantic, bloated look, the look of a man who is running out of lies to tell. He looked like a cornered animal, and for the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel the urge to rescue him. I felt the cool, detached observation of a surgeon watching a terminal disease take its course. He had used my life as a credit line for too long, and the bill was finally coming due. Then there was Janice. Through a burner social media account, I watched her digital life play out like a slow-motion car crash. She was still posting photos in designer clothes, posing in front of mirrors in high-end boutiques, but the desperation was bleeding through the filters. The comment sections of her posts were no longer filled with goals and heart emojis. They were being flooded by people asking why her father's company hadn't returned their deposits, or why their luxury condos were nothing more than empty dirt lots. She was still trying to play the role of the privileged heiress, but she was standing on a foundation of sand. I remembered her laughing as she left me in the 110-degree heat, telling me to diagnose my way out. Well, I had diagnosed the problem. She was the product of a father who taught her that people were objects to be used. And now, she was about to find out that when you use people up, you eventually find yourself very, very alone. The contrast between our lives was a study in poetic justice. Every morning, I woke up at 5 a.m., my body tired but my mind clear. I worked 12-hour days treating coal miners, teachers, and retirees, people who knew the value of a hard-earned dollar. They trusted me with their lives, and I honored that trust with every stitch and every prescription. I was a pillar of a community that actually mattered. Meanwhile, Kyle and Janice were living in a house of cards, terrified of every phone call and every knock at the door. I saw a report that their primary residence in Los Gatos had been hit with a lien. The very roof I had paid for with my surgical bonuses was now being claimed by the banks. It was the ultimate irony. They had thrown me out to secure their fortune, and in doing so, they had lost the only person who was actually keeping them afloat. One evening, after a particularly long day of flu vaccinations, I sat in my office and looked at my bank balance. It wasn't millions. It wasn't even hundreds of thousands. But it was mine. It was tucked away in a small local credit union where the manager knew my name and my story. I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost physical. I had proven them wrong. I had self-relied my way into a life of meaning and respect. I had almost forgotten about the legal storm brewing in San Francisco until my phone buzzed on the desk. It wasn't an alert. It was a text message from a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. It was Janice. The message was short, devoid of the usual emojis or fluff. "Mom, please, we need to talk. It's an emergency. Dad he's in trouble. We all are. Please call me back." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the block button. For a split second, the old Lauren, the one who wanted to fix everything, the matriarch who would sacrifice herself for her family, felt a tug at her heart. But then I looked at the callous skin on my palms. I remembered the smell of the Mojave sand. I remembered the way they didn't look back as they drove away. The tug vanished, replaced by a cold, clinical curiosity. The trap was set, and the prey was finally starting to scream. The vibration of my phone on the desk sounded like a rattlesnake in the quiet of the clinic. I stared at the word "mom" on the screen, a word Janice hadn't used with any sincerity in years. It was a title she only dusted off when she wanted a new car or a bailout from a credit card debt. My thumb hovered over the screen, not with hesitation, but with the calculated calm of a hunter, waiting for the prey to step fully into the light. I pressed accept. The silence on the other end lasted only a heartbeat before Janice's voice came through. jagged and frantic, stripped of its usual influencer-perfect lilt. "Mom? Oh my God, you finally picked up. We've been calling for days. Why are you in the middle of nowhere? Do you have any idea what's happening back here?" I leaned back in my wooden chair, looking out the window at the rugged peaks of the ridge, and kept my voice soft, almost hesitant, the voice of the woman they thought they had broken. "I've been busy, Janice. People here actually need me. What's the emergency?" Before she could answer, the phone was snatched away. I heard the familiar, heavy breathing of Kyle. "Lauren, listen to me," he barked, his tone a sickening cocktail of fake urgency and the old dominant authority he used to control our household. "We don't have time for your little soul-searching retreat in the sticks. There's a hearing with the medical board in 3 weeks. Those Apex biofools are looking for a fall guy because of some discrepancies in the clinical trials. It's all a big misunderstanding, a clerical mess, but they're coming after the assets. Our assets." I felt a cold smile touch my lips. "Discrepancies, Kyle? That sounds serious." He let out a sharp, impatient huff. "It's nothing you can't fix. We just need you to show up and testify that you were the one who supervised the data entry. You just have to say that any errors were accidental, fatigue, heavy caseload, whatever. If you take the responsibility for the oversight, the board will just give you a slap on the wrist, a fine, maybe a temporary suspension. But if you don't, they'll freeze everything. The house, the investments, everything I've built for us." "The house is already under a lien, Kyle," I said, my voice as neutral as a saline drip. There was a pause. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, wondering how much I knew. Then Janice's voice chimed in, sounding like she was on speakerphone now. "Mom, please. If the bank takes the house, where am I supposed to go? My brand is just starting to take off. I can't be homeless because of a clerical error in your files. You always told me that being a doctor meant being responsible. Well, this is your department. You signed the papers, didn't you? Just go to the hearing and tell them it was a mistake so we can move on. Don't be selfish." The sheer, unadulterated gall of it was almost breathtaking. They weren't just asking me to help. They were demanding I commit professional suicide to save the very assets they had already stolen from me. They wanted me to lie to a federal board so they could keep living in a house I paid for, while I took the fall for a crime that had killed 3 people. "I see," I whispered, injecting a tremor into my voice to keep them on the hook. "You want me to tell them I made the mistakes? But Kyle, if I lose my license, I can't work. How will I support myself?" Kyle's voice softened then, sliding into that oily, manipulative charm that had fooled me for 12 years. "Honey, don't worry about that. Once the heat is off, I'll have the project in Nevada up and running. We'll be set for life. You won't ever have to work another shift. You can just relax, go to the spa, be the lady of the house again. But I need you to be a team player here, for the family, for Janice's future. You've always been our rock, Lauren. Don't let us down now." It was the same old song, the same tired lyrics of family and sacrifice used to gaslight me into submission. They truly believed I was still that same exhausted woman who would sign anything just to keep the peace. 3 weeks, you said? I asked, my mind already calculating the logistics of the showdown in San Francisco. "The hearing is at the State Building?" Kyle sounded relieved, his voice regaining its smug edge. "Yes, I've already talked to the lawyers. We'll pick you up, get you a decent suit, something that says distracted but dedicated, and we'll handle the rest. Just stay put until then. And Lauren, don't go talking to anyone else about this. Let's keep it in the family." I stared at the stack of receipts on my desk, the surgical logs, the GPS data from the truck convoy, the forged affidavits. "Of course, Kyle," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "Let's keep it in the family. I'll see you at the hearing." I hung up before he could say another word. They thought they were leading me to the slaughterhouse. They had no idea I was the one who had already built the cage. They left me to die in the heat, and now they want me to burn in a courtroom for their crimes. Janice actually called me Mom after 3 years of silence, only to ask me to throw my life away for her Instagram feed. Do you think a mother's love should cover for a criminal child? Or is it time for them to face the law? Like this video and comment the word justice if you think I should let them fall. I need to hear from you before I walk into that room. The 3 weeks leading up to the hearing were a masterclass in psychological warfare, though my opponents didn't even know they were on the battlefield. I didn't stay in Silver Ridge to wait for Kyle's rescue. I took a leave of absence from the clinic, telling Arthur I had some family business to settle in the city. The townspeople looked at me with a mixture of concern and knowing silence. They knew a woman on a mission when they saw one. I took the bus into San Francisco, checking into a modest hotel under my maiden name, Miller. I didn't need a luxury suite. I needed a base of operations. My first call wasn't to Kyle's high-priced, shark-eyed attorneys. It was to Marcus Thorne, a man I had gone to medical school with, who had pivoted into health law 20 years ago. Marcus was the kind of lawyer who didn't care about billboards or television ads. He was the one the big hospitals called when they wanted a problem to disappear quietly and permanently. When I met Marcus in his wood-paneled office overlooking the Embarcadero, I didn't look like the broken woman Kyle had left in the dirt. I sat across from him, my back straight, and laid out the 3-year timeline of fraud, forgery, and clinical malpractice. I showed him the hospital logs from Sarah, the GPS coordinates from Silas's truck, and the receipts from the motel in Silver Ridge that proved I was hundreds of miles away on the days my signature appeared on the Apex Bio affidavits. Marcus didn't say a word for 10 minutes. He just flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with every document. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of pure professional awe. "Lauren," he whispered, "they didn't just steal from you. They built a gallows and expected you to tie the noose yourself. This isn't just a defense, it's a controlled demolition. But for this to work, for us to get the board to turn their sights entirely on Kyle and the pharmaceutical company, we need them to believe you're exactly who they think you are, a frightened, compliant witness." I took his advice to heart. For the next 10 days, I played the role of the matriarch in distress to perfection. I answered Kyle's calls with a voice that was brittle and peppered with long, hesitant pauses. I let him coach me on my testimony, listening as he fed me lines about my exhaustion and my regrettable oversights. Every time he spoke, I felt a surge of nausea, but I kept my tone soft. "I just want this to be over, Kyle," I told him during one late-night call. "I just want to come home." I could almost hear the triumphant smirk through the line. "Soon, honey," he'd say. "Just do your part at the state building, and everything goes back to normal." Normal. The word felt like a slap. He truly believed he could rewrite the last 3 years with a few lines of coached perjury. He truly believed I was that stupid. Janice was even more transparent. She sent me links to professional outfits on luxury retail sites, suggesting I wear something subtle and non-threatening, like a beige wool suit. "You need to look like someone the board will feel sorry for you," she texted. "Not like a cold-hearted career woman." I looked at the links and laughed. She wanted me to look like a victim because she needed me to be one. I ignored her suggestions and went to a small independent tailor in the Mission District. I bought a suit of charcoal gray, the color of a storm cloud. It was sharp, architectural, and projected a level of authority that no beige wool could ever touch. It was the suit of a woman who was coming to reclaim her throne. The night before the hearing, Kyle insisted on meeting me at a diner near the Civic Center to go over the final details. He arrived looking polished, wearing a watch I knew had been bought with my pension money. He reached across the table to take my hand, but I pulled away to reach for my water, a subtle rejection he was too arrogant to notice. He handed me a folder with a typed statement. "Read this exactly as it's written, Lauren. Don't ad-lib. The board members are already skeptical, but if you show some emotion, maybe a few tears about the stress of the pandemic and your workload, they'll go easy on you. I looked at the paper. It was a full confession disguised as a plea for mercy. If I read this, I was admitting to criminal negligence. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" I asked, my voice a whisper. Kyle leaned in, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hustle. "I've always looked out for us, Lauren. You know that. I'm the one who handles the hard stuff, so you can play doctor. Just trust me one last time." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hollow shell of a man who had never done an honest day's work in his life. He wasn't a shark. He was a parasite. And tomorrow, I was going to be the antibiotic. I tucked the statement into my bag, the bag he had once thrown into the Mojave dust. "I'll see you in the morning, Kyle," I said, standing up. "I won't miss a word." I walked out of the diner and into the cool San Francisco fog, feeling a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The surgery was scheduled for 9 a.m., and unlike Kyle, I never missed an appointment. The morning of the hearing, San Francisco was draped in a thick, slate-gray fog that swallowed the tops of the skyscrapers and turned the Golden Gate Bridge into a ghostly silhouette. The air was damp and bit through even the heaviest coats, but inside the State Building, the atmosphere was stiflingly clinical. I arrived early, standing across the street with a paper cup of black coffee, watching the players take their positions. Kyle and Janice arrived in a black town car, likely rented with what was left of my credit, and they looked like they were heading to a gala rather than a medical board hearing. Kyle wore a navy-tailored suit with a silk tie the color of a power play, and Janice was a vision of calculated sympathy in a modest cream dress, her eyes hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, posing for a candid photo Janice's assistant took, likely for a family strength post on her crumbling social media feed. They weren't just prepared for a hearing, they were performing. When they spotted me in the lobby, Kyle rushed over with a look of practiced concern, his hands reaching out to pull me into a paternalistic embrace. I let him. I let my body go slightly limp, playing the part of the weary, defeated woman he expected. "You look tired, Lauren," he whispered into my ear, his voice carrying that familiar, condescending warmth. "But don't worry, we're going to get through this. Just remember the statement. 1 hour of discomfort, and we have our lives back." Janice stepped forward, brushing a stray hair from my shoulder with a touch that felt like a spider crawling on my skin. "You should have worn the beige," she whispered, her eyes scanning my charcoal suit with disapproval. "You look a bit too sharp. We want them to pity you, not be intimidated by you. But I guess it'll have to do. Try to keep your head down." We entered the hearing room, a cavernous space with high ceilings, mahogany paneling, and a long, curved bench where the 7 members of the medical board sat like high priests of a secular religion. They were seasoned professionals, men and women who had spent decades in white coats, people who could spot a liar as easily as they could spot a heart murmur. The lawyers for Apex Bio were already seated at a side table, looking like a row of vultures in expensive wool. They didn't even look at us. To them, I was just a liability to be mitigated, a name on a legal brief that needed to be erased. Kyle sat next to me, his hand resting firmly on my forearm, a gesture that looked supportive to an outsider, but felt like a shackle to me. He leaned in, whispering one last time, "Stay the course, Lauren. Everything depends on you." The chairman of the board, a silver-haired surgeon named Dr. Sterling, with eyes like flint, hammered his gavel. The sound echoed through the room with a finality that made my pulse steady into a cold, rhythmic beat. "This hearing is convened to investigate allegations of clinical fraud and professional negligence regarding the Apex Bio trials," Sterling announced, his voice devoid of emotion. As the lead prosecutor for the board began to lay out the charges, the room became a theater of shadows. I watched as Kyle played his role to perfection, nodding solemnly at the mention of unfortunate errors, casting supportive glances my way whenever the prosecutor mentioned the oversight of the lead investigator. He was the picture of the devoted husband, a man burdened by his wife's exhaustion, but standing by her nonetheless. Beside him, Janice sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of tragic concern. She even managed to squeeze out a few tears when the names of the 3 deceased patients were read aloud. The sheer performance of it made my stomach turn. They were using the deaths of 3 innocent people as a backdrop for their own financial salvation. Kyle leaned over and squeezed my arm, his eyes urging me to look more distraught, to lean into the broken doctor persona. I looked down at the typed statement he had given me, the one that confessed to everything. I felt the weight of the receipts in my own folder, the evidence that would strip away their masks and reveal the rot beneath. The prosecutor turned his gaze toward our table. "Dr. Price," he said, his voice echoing in the hushing room, "we have reviewed the affidavits bearing your signature. We have heard the testimony from Apex Bio, claiming you were the sole authority on these datasets. Is there anything you wish to say before we move to the formal questioning?" I felt Kyle's hand tighten on my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. A silent command to stand up and read the script. I felt Janice lean forward, her breath held in anticipation of the win she thought was coming. I stood up slowly, my charcoal suit rustling in the silence. I didn't look at Kyle. I didn't look at Janice. I looked straight at Dr. Sterling, and for the first time in 3 years, I let the full weight of my authority as a physician fill my voice. "Yes, Mr. Chairman," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the manufactured tension of the room. "I have a great deal to say, but the statement in front of me is a work of fiction. I'd like to present the facts." The shift in the room was instantaneous. The air didn't just get colder, it froze. The silence that followed my words was not empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the sudden shift of power in the room. Kyle's hand dropped from my arm as if he'd been burned, his face pale, the smugness draining away to reveal a raw, jagged panic. "Lauren, what are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a frantic whisper that barely carried to the board. "Read the statement, now." I didn't even glance at him. I reached into my own leather portfolio, the one I had purchased with my first honest paycheck from the Silver Ridge Clinic, and pulled out a stack of color-coded documents. "Members of the board," I began, my voice projecting with the practiced authority of a chief resident. "For 3 years, I was led to believe that my life was a series of unfortunate accidents. But a doctor is trained to look for patterns, and today, I am presenting the pattern of a criminal enterprise." I stepped toward the evidence screen, my movements precise. "The prosecution mentions 34 affidavits signed by me between 2024 and 2026. Let's look at the first one, dated August 12th. I clicked a remote and a slide appeared. On this day, I supposedly signed a clinical clearance in Palo Alto. However, here is a time-stamped receipt from the Mojave Roadside Motel and a GPS log from a Peterbilt tractor-trailer belonging to a Mr. Silas Vance. On August 12th, I wasn't in an office. I was standing in 110-degree heat on the side of a highway, having been abandoned by the man sitting to my left after he had systematically drained my pension funds. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. I saw Janice's jaw drop, her tragic daughter mask shattering into 1,000 pieces of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at her father, then at me, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. But I wasn't finished. "Let's move to the medical evidence," I continued, my voice growing colder, sharper. "The Apex Bio records claim I reviewed patient data on November 14th at 2 p.m. But here," I flicked to the next slide, "are the scrub-in logs from St. Jude's Hospital. At 2 p.m. on that day, I was 5 hours into a complex cardiac bypass. I was in a sterile field, under a microscope, with 6 other medical professionals as witnesses. Unless I have discovered the secret to bilocation, these signatures are not mine. They are forgeries, executed by someone with intimate access to my personal files and a deep knowledge of my handwriting." I turned then, finally looking Kyle in the eye. He looked small. The expensive suit and the silk tie now looked like a costume on a man who had finally run out of stage. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding," Janice suddenly blurted out, her voice high and shrill, breaking the decorum of the court. "She's lying. She's just bitter because of the divorce." Dr. Sterling hammered his gavel with a force that made the mahogany bench groan. "Silence," he thundered, his eyes fixed on me with a newfound, piercing respect. "Dr. Price, do you have evidence regarding the financial motivation for these forgeries?" I nodded, pulling out the final set of documents. "I have the offshore bank records for Clark Heritage Holdings, a shell company managed by Kyle Clark. It shows a direct deposit of $2 million from Apex Bio, funneled through a pharmacy benefit manager, on the exact days these fraudulent reports were filed. I didn't bring a confession today, gentlemen. I brought a diagnosis of a parasite that has been feeding on my reputation and the lives of 3 innocent patients for far too long." The room erupted. The lawyers for Apex Bio began shouting, trying to distance themselves from Kyle as quickly as possible. The board members were leaning over, whispering urgently. Kyle slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, finally realizing that the distracted doctor he had left in the desert had spent the last 3 years sharpening a scalpel just for him. Janice was sobbing now, but they weren't the tears of a grieving daughter. They were the hysterical sobs of a girl who realized her influencer lifestyle was about to be traded for a court-appointed attorney. As the bailiffs moved toward our table, I leaned over to Kyle, my voice a whisper that only he could hear. "You told me to remember my lessons on self-reliance, Kyle," I said, my words like ice. "Well, here is your grade. You're on your own now. Good luck with the walk." I turned and walked toward the exit, my head held high, leaving the wreckage of their lies behind me. The cancer had been removed. The recovery could finally begin. As I stepped out of the state building, the heavy San Francisco fog was finally beginning to burn off, revealing a sky so blue it looked like it had been scrubbed clean. I stood on the granite steps for a long moment, breathing in the salt air and the sound of the city, feeling the weight of 12 years finally lift from my shoulders. Justice is often called a blind goddess, but in that courtroom, she had eyes like a hawk. Kyle was arrested before he could even leave the building. The evidence of money laundering, criminal forgery, and his role in the deaths of those 3 patients was so ironclad that even his high-priced attorneys began to distance themselves as the handcuffs clicked shut. I saw him one last time as he was led through the side exit. He looked small, gray, and utterly hollow. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. The man who thought he could hustle his way through a human life had finally run out of road. Janice's downfall was different, but no less absolute. Within hours of the hearing, the digital empire she had built on a foundation of my stolen hard work crumbled. Her sponsors dropped her as the news of the scandal broke, and the luxury apartment I had unknowingly funded was reclaimed by the estate. She sent me one final message that evening, a string of desperate, incoherent apologies, mixed with demands for one last loan to help her get a lawyer. I didn't reply. I didn't block her either. I simply deleted the message and the contact. I had spent a decade being her rock, only to realize she was a whirlpool that would have eventually sucked me under. I realized then that a mother's love is a gift for the grateful, not a shield for the predatory. She had asked me to see how I'd handle real-world application, and the world had finally applied its lessons to her. I took the bus back to Silver Ridge the following day. I didn't need a town car or a driver. I liked the rhythm of the road and the steady hum of the engine. When the bus pulled into the dusty station at the edge of town, I saw Arthur waiting there in his old dented pickup truck. He didn't say much. People in the Ridge don't waste words. But he tipped his cap and handed me a thermos of that same lukewarm coffee from the night I saved his grandson. "Welcome back, Doc," he said, his voice gruff with a respect that money could never buy. The clinic needs sweeping, and Mrs. Gable is convinced her hip is acting up again. We missed you." I smiled, and for the first time in years, the smile reached my eyes. I was home. My medical license was fully cleared, and the board even issued a public commendation for my role in exposing the Apex biofraud. But the real victory wasn't the piece of paper. It was the life I had built with my own 2 hands. My grandmother used to say that the American dream wasn't about the gold at the end of the rainbow, but the character of the person walking the road. I had walked through the fire of the Mojave and the ice of a San Francisco courtroom, and I had come out tempered like steel. Price Medical is now a thriving practice, staffed by local nurses I've trained myself, serving a community that knows the value of integrity. I don't have a mansion in Los Gatos or a silk-lined wardrobe, but I have the peace of a woman who owes no one a cent and whose name is spoken with honor. I sit on my porch now as the sun sets over the ridge, watching the mountains turn purple and gold. I think back to that woman standing in the 110-degree heat, clutching a dusty purse and watching a black SUV disappear into the haze. I want to tell her that the desert wasn't an end. It was a beginning. It was the place where I had to lose everything to remember who I was. I am Dr. Lauren Price. I am a healer, a survivor, and a woman who finally understands that the greatest investment you can ever make is in your own soul. The road was long and the heat was high, but I wouldn't change a single mile of it. I finally reached the destination, and the view from here is breathtaking. In the end, it wasn't the heat of the desert that defined me, but the strength I found within it. Kyle and Janice thought they could bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed. Thank you for listening to my journey. Do you think I was too harsh, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of resilience. God bless.